This is Let's Talk Energy, your go-to podcast for smart energy insights. I'm your host, Noah Brenner. And each week, we're bringing you an inside look at the dynamics shaping global energy markets through in-depth conversations with our own Rystad Energy experts, as well as some special guests. In today's episode, we look at the contentious and ever-evolving plan to clean up the global shipping industry. Shipping is a vital part of the global economy, with 80 to 90% of global trade traveling by boat in some way. But it's also a major source of emissions, accounting for 2 to as much as 3% of the global total. And it's one of the hardest sectors to electrify. Now, shipping's governing body, the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, has laid out an ambitious plan to incentivize ship owners to hit net zero emissions by 2050. But, as with all of these proposals, the devil is in the details. The IMO is due to meet starting on October 14th to vote on the plan, but is coming under increasing pressure from the Trump administration, which opposes the proposal and has threatened an array of tariffs, port duties, and even visa restrictions on those countries that support it. So, will the IMO's plan, as it's laid out today, push the shipping industry into a greener future without adding too much cost for ship owners or consumers? Which fuels could be the winners in the race to provide low carbon alternatives? And how could ship owners' choices impact the broader market for those fuels? And finally, can the proposal overcome US opposition to pass? And what happens if it doesn't? To help us find the answers to these questions and more, I'm joined from Oslo by two leading clean shipping experts in our analysis division, Senior Vice President Joe Friedmann and Vice President Junlin Yu. Joe, Junlin, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you, Noah.
Let's talk energy. So, in as few words as possible, what is the goal of this IMO proposal and exactly how does it propose to achieve that?
The shipping is responsible for 2 to 3% of the global emissions already. Almost the entire fleet is still running on fossil fuels. So basically, the purpose of this IMO net zero framework is to help shipping industries to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions with the aim to achieve net zero emission target by 2050. And then to be able to make that happen, and then the net zero framework has proposed a combination of technical measure and also economic measure. On the technical side, then it has it basically consists two-tiered compliance system that has a direct compliance target and also a base target. How this works is that if the fuels burned on your vessel has a greenhouse gas intensity below the direct target, then you are good, you're complied with the regulation, then you can also even potentially generate some surplus units. But then if your greenhouse gas intensity is above the direct target, that will incur some remedial units. And this is when the economic measure comes into place, then that means you need to pay penalty for those remedial units. And the reason why they want to have this penalty is basically to make those fossil fuels more and more expensive and then financially forcing ship owners to switch to cleaner fuels such as green ammonia or green methanol. And what we also should remember is this framework is not just about penalizing conventional fuels, but it's also about incentivizing the adoption of clean fuels. So how that works is the penalty they collected, they will form a net zero fund, and then partial of this fund, they will use that to reward those clean fuels. But then, of course, they have set up some standard for those clean fuels who should be really qualified to receive those rewards. And they haven't really determined how the exactly reward will work yet. But many ship owners, fuel producers are looking forward to have more clarity on that.
I know both of you have been crunching the numbers on this, and so what do we here at Rystad Energy think about this? And how maybe do our views differ from consensus or from what else is out there?
Decarbonizing the maritime sector is a ecosystem challenge, and in many ways the pace of the shipping transition will be very much dependent on the pace of the global energy system. How fast can the global energy system move from using fossil fuels to renewables? And therefore, we think that we in Rystad Energy, we are quite in a unique position here to analyze the impact of the IMO net zero framework. We have a large analyst organization that covers all the primary energy sources, and we look at how this trickles through to all the different end sectors, which gives us then the ability to look at the shipping transition in the context of the broader energy transition. Just to give an example, currently the ton miles in shipping, 40% of that is related to energy shipping, and over time, this means that those vessels that transport crude oil, oil products, coal, over time that ton mile demand has to go down with the global energy transition. However, the pace of it will depend on the how fast the global energy transition is happening. But on top of that, there's many other moving targets, and you need kind of data and analysis to look at that. And for instance, the production capacity of biofuels or synthetic fuels, or what is the shipping, the sector competition shipping is facing from other types of industries such as road transportation and aviation, and also how are the cost of these alternative fuels evolving over time is important. So we try to take all of this into consideration to evaluate the IMO net zero framework. Could be some challenges of meeting the IMO emission trajectory towards 2050, and there can also be some kind of unwanted consequences of doing so.
One thing people tend to overlook in the market is about fleet readiness. So basically, except the biofuels, you do need actually vessels that are equipped with those specific engine to run on those fuels, and that's people tend to forget that. And to be able to build those vessels, it will take time, investment, and also yard capacity. So for example, our yard analysis side, we say that the most of these advanced shipyards in South Korea and China are already over 90% utilized. And then it also takes a couple of years to build those vessels. One more thing is also about the engine side. From the engine manufacturing or till all these shipyards get the license to be able to build, they need to test it properly, everything works, then they can scale the production. So that process also take 1 to 2 years. And our maritime energy transition, we say that by 2035, if you want to achieve net zero, to try to follow this net zero trajectory, it will take around 50% of the global fleet to run on those clean fuels. And then that means we also know that the biofuels are a bit limited. So the majority of those fuels or vessels needs to be equipped with those engines. So given this time frame from now to 2035, will really the yard capacity to be able to build that many vessels is a big question also in the market.
So, I mean, there's both an ecosystem of the shipping industry that needs to evolve, as well as a broader energy ecosystem that needs to enable that as well. So, can the proposal achieve its goals, do you think? I mean, what are the strengths, and where might there be maybe some weaknesses?
I guess the one main strength here is that the shipping industry has one global regulator, which is the IMO. And the net zero framework, it gives the whole industry a very clear direction that, if you continue to use fossil fuels, it will be expensive. It should come a cost of polluting. And I think also the framework already has quite a broad, kind of a broad backing. And the industry sees that, it's the decarbonization is gaining momentum. We see, new technology developments. We see infrastructure rollout. We see companies that are reducing emissions either by route optimization. They invest in emission reduction technologies, or they have already started to use alternative fuels. I think many of the companies many of the countries that are voting for the regulation, they realize, it's not a perfect regulation. It is kind of understood that this can be refined over time, and also kind of realizing that not adopting the net zero framework can maybe just add on uncertainty, and the uncertainty will then grow further, and then the whole transition will be postponed. One other strength I want to highlight is what Junlin also mentioned, that there is a thinking here there should be some revenue distribution. So the IMO fund will collect penalties and revenues, and then allocate this some share of it at least to developing countries, making sure that developing countries can take part in the transition, because there will be some additional transportation cost of this as well, because the fuels will get more expensive. Give a little bit of context. We have looked at our kind of house view scenario. We have also looked at the what if the IMO trajectories are met? So we have like a net zero trajectory that we looked into as well, and then we have identified some weaknesses, I guess, in both scenarios.
When you look at the data and how we really stress the test different scenarios, we do see some risks from this net zero framework. So the first one is if the net zero trajectory is followed, that means if there are enough actually fuels to supply to the shipping industry ready for the shipping companies to use, but then that also means they will have a lot of surplus units in the market. So no, I remember in the beginning I mentioned about if you are complied with the target, you can generate some surplus units. So the trick here from the framework is that it allows the ship owners, if they have these remedial tier 2 remedial units, they can purchase surplus units from the market to offset these remedial units without paying penalty to the regulation. So then from what we see is in this scenario, there will be enough surplus units to almost completely offset this remedial, this tier 2 remedial units. Then if, of course, if we assume the market is operating at the full efficiency. And then the consequence of this is that it will be only tier 1 penalty will be collected, and that number is less than 10 billion USD per year. And based on the amount that is really used with this clean fuels used, is not enough to reward those fuels. So this is a very key message that means this framework is contradicting to the net zero goal they have set. If you want to achieve that and you want to reward, but the penalty mechanism you have set up is not enough to really reward those fuels. And we know that nowadays this production cost of those, especially synthetic fuels, are really high. So you would still need reward to bridge the cost gap between those fuels and the fossil fuels, even after the penalty, after the surplus units trading revenue. So then if that part is not there, then that means even the fuel is enough. Ship owners will feel like, okay, it's too expensive for me to use, and because regulation is not really helping me to bridge the cost gap, then maybe we will not really adopt it. So that's the first risk. And the second risk is also from our house view, when we look at it from more realistic scenario that Joe mentioned in the beginning, with the whole energy system, so manufacturers influencing this. And then we see that it will be a quite slow transition in the beginning. Then that means that the amount of clean fuels is not as much as in the net zero scenario. And then the penalty being collected from those non-compliant fuels will be quite substantial. So that's like started from around 12-13 billion USD in 2028 already, and then reached to over 90 billion USD in 2035. So that's quite big numbers. And if IMO decided to say reward 300 USD per ton of CO2 equivalent to those clean fuels every year, then our calculation shows that the cumulative fund balance in 2035 can already reach to 160 billion. To just give like a context of this fund size, is already equivalent to a small country's GDP. So that means we don't want this net zero framework suddenly ending up like a money collector to just collect a lot of money on hand without really rewarding to the industry, because it's just a very niche sector of those fuels manage to receive that, especially with a requirement that they have set on those fuels who qualify to receive the reward.
So really, we need to make sure that we align the rewards and the penalties in such a way that it actually enables and incentivizes clean fuels use, rather than just being a kind of a penalty system that ship owners maybe pay into, but don't actually shift the choices that they're making with regards to their fleet. Now, we've talked a little bit about the house view. I just wanted to let all our listeners know, if you'd like to know more about that, we did talk about our overall house views in an earlier episode. So please check out our episode list after this program. But I want to ask, I mean, if you could make a recommendation about how to make this proposal better, what would you recommend? What should the IMO do to make sure that those rewards and penalties do actually lead to change?
It's a very, very, really difficult question, and IMO have to really consider so many things. So, but we can, of course, from our research, we can provide some views what we see from the current framework. So, the first thing what we have observed is the ship owners are really cautious to make investments now. For example, to invest some new alternative fuel, dual fuel vessels, or go to local long-term fuel agreement with some fuel producers, especially compared to the year in 2023 that the momentum was really high. And now it's actually ship owners are very cautious. And at the same time, fuel producers also struggle to really get the long-term firm offtake agreement from the shipping companies. The main reason for this is actually there are so many uncertainties for regulations and the different policies. And IMO net zero framework uncertainty is a very large factor here. For example, how the reward mechanism is actually going to work, how biofuels is going to be adopted, will it be book and claim or will it be mass balance mechanism? There's a lot of uncertainties, and then the industry is waiting for clarity to take actions. So then I would say the first recommendation is IMO should maybe try to reduce uncertainty as much as possible to give more clarity to the market, so people can actually start to take some actions instead of slowing down the transition. And also the second one is IMO maybe should do more realistic assessment on just say how possible it is to achieve its target, just given all this yacht capacity constraint, bunker infrastructure constraint, fuel supply constraint. So it's like many of these factors. So just try to make a little bit more realistic target. Otherwise, you could ending up either you become a money collector or you become it's like not really enough incentive for the shipping industry to offtake those green fuels. That's like the main recommendations that we have for IMO so far.
Let's talk in a little bit more depth about those fuels. We've mentioned them a few times, and there are a number of them. And so, what are the implications for fuels here? Could the decisions of the shipping industry actually have ripple effects for the producers of these cleaner fuels, whether it's biofuels, e-fuels, as you've mentioned? What could some of the outcomes there be?
If this regulation is being passed, then it will have major implications on the fuel market within shipping and the adoption of alternative fuels. Like ship owners has the tendencies to pick whatever is cheapest. So without any regulation, I guess it will be kind of status quo and continue on fossil fuels. But this sector is currently burning around 300 million tons of fuels per year. So it's quite substantial, and it's mainly fossil fuels. We now expect to see a more clear shift towards alternative fuels. And that will, of course, have a ripple effect for the whole fuel market. And hopefully it will unlock some of these green fuel investments that the shipping industry is looking for. Many classify shipping as a hard-to-abate sector. I think we would argue that shipping is actually quite easy to decarbonize because you have so many fuels to choose from. So you mentioned some of them, right? But the synthetic fuels, there's a lot of talk about those, also referred to as e-fuels because they have very low carbon footprint. So, of course, they get a lot of media attention, and that's like e-ammonia, e-methanol, e-LNG. But currently, these are maybe around 3 to 5 times as expensive as conventional fuels. So what we see in our analysis is that maybe the IMO will not be able to reward what is needed to bridge the cost gap between these e-fuels and conventional fuels in the near term. However, a little bit more in the longer term, when you see the increasing penalties will penalize fossil fuels more, and also you will see the production cost of these synthetic fuels come down due to learning curve, economies of scale, etc. There will be a point where these fuels will be competitive. But we maybe see that more in the 2040s rather than very soon. But then you have, as you mentioned, biofuels. You have different types there as well: biodiesel, biomethanol, bio-LNG, and we see that those fuels under the current framework and under certain assumptions actually can be very price competitive with conventional fuels already from 2028. So then the limitation there is more about, can we actually get access to these fuels? Because there will be some limitations. For instance, for biodiesel, you will have The feedstock availability will always be a concern, and then you will have very strong sector competition, particularly from aviation and road transportation. So even though biofuels can be a great solution for shipping, we see that it can be a little bit limited on how large share of the fuel mix they will make up. Then you have conventional LNG. Can also be a competitive solution in the IMO framework, with some risks around the fuel. But when we're looking at the current order book of what companies are ordering, and for those that are dual fuel, then we see that LNG is by far the most popular option.
And within those alternatives, perhaps an evolution, not necessarily, proposal passes, flip a switch, things change, but perhaps an evolution of what would be most competitive. So, we've talked about some risks. We've talked about the evolution needed within the market. But if I'm a ship owner, what is it that would keep me awake? What is it that I'm laying in bed wondering about with this regulation as we run up to the meeting?
The main three things we have observed is first is to see, okay, the ship owners will think, should we act or not? And it requires so much investment. And then what should we do? Because then they are waiting. So the first question is, should we act or not? And then the second question is, you see some ship owners maybe already plan to take some actions, but then okay, what should we do? Should we stick to biofuels? Should we go for ammonia dual fuel vessels? Should we go for methanol dual fuel vessels? And then those are very expensive, and then that will trigger the third question is okay, will there be enough really reliable supply for me in the market for my ships to run in the future? Will the regulation manage to actually help me to bridge the cost gap? Because you don't want to invest this into so heavy or expensive vessels, but then you don't have enough fuel, or suddenly the fuel cost is very expensive that cannot really let you make any profit, right? So that's the main things that the ship owners are really concerning right now. That's what we see.
So it sounds like there's quite a bit there to consider, quite a bit to keep you up at night if you're a ship owner. But what about consumers? I mean, we've used the term expensive a number of times throughout our conversation, and 80 to 90% of global trade is touching the shipping industry at some point in its transit. And so, do consumers need to worry about costs going up?
Global shipping already transport 80 to 90% of the goods. So it's a very efficient transportation logistic. And then that means of course it will be more expensive. It comes with a cost, no matter if you go for clean fuels or fossil fuels with a penalty, it will be some higher cost. But when you break the cost down to each product, for example, each of your sneaker or your headphone, the cost will be very marginal. But then of course you will depend a little bit on the exact cargo. Maybe for some industries who are heavily relied on this shipping, and then that's a big cost of the whole cost picture that might have some impact. But I will say for end consumer related to, for example, retail goods, it will not really have so much impact compared to the impact to ship owners, to fuel producers, or to bunkering infrastructures.
So ship owners probably will continue to lose a bit of sleep over this. Consumers, you should rest easy. It's probably the least of our inflation worries at this point. But Joe, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that this has pretty broad support. I mean, the IMO's net zero framework, the draft proposal, was initially passed with, I think it was 63 countries voting in favor, some of which are major shippers. 16 countries voted no, and then 24 abstained. But we have seen this regulation from U.S. President Donald Trump. And he has actually threatened everything from port duties to additional potentially tariffs, if countries support this. And so what is the outlook for passage at this meeting coming up here?
Yeah, as you say, Noah, I mean, the initial proposal almost had 80% support, around 80% that voted in favor. And US kind of pressure here can add some uncertainty leading up to the MEPC October meeting. But I still think it's possible that this will, be approved. So I guess in general, many in the industry believes that this will be adopted, and you actually only need 2/3 of the countries voting for. So you have some kind of leeway compared to the last meeting. And I think what many are kind of realizing that it's better to have a global regulation. It gives more clarity to ship owners, fuel producers, to investors in general, than to have a more like a fragmented regulation for the shipping industry. So I still think it's positive, even though the US has definitely added some additional risks before the October meeting.
I mean, I think you've obviously painted a picture of fairly broad support, but I mean, what happens if this doesn't pass at the upcoming meeting?
Will most likely happen is that the pace or the momentum of the transition that we have seen in the shipping industry already will slow down, and I would add maybe even more uncertainty than the industry is already facing, and then this can happen like for a prolonged time.
And as you pointed out, that uncertainty, one of the key things that's keeping ship owners up at night, and that's preventing the investments that are needed. But what about this as a framework? I mean, as we've said, shipping is a difficult industry to electrify, and is oftentimes considered hard to abate. But could this be perhaps a framework for other industries? Is there applicability to some of these other industries that have struggled to electrify, or maybe aren't right for electrification?
The fact that this has a global scope targeting a whole industry, and it's an international industry, and then you have other industries that kind of are a little bit similar in the same way as aviation, cement industry, steel industry, chemicals. And then also the framework is kind of technology neutral. So, we enforce some emission intensity targets, and then it's up to the industry to decide what is the best pathway forward. You don't try to enforce one fuel or one solution on the industry, which is something that can also be applicable to other industries. I think we are also in the favor of this mechanism that you collect money into a fund that can help developing countries to also embrace the transition. But the question is how easy this is to implement in other industries. I mean, you have a global regulator in aviation, but you don't have that in, for instance, in steel or in chemicals. So then how do you kind of enforce it on a global level when you don't have a global regulator? I guess that is a bit more difficult.
Even though there are some risks, there are some maybe potential consequences with it, but that's something that IMO should really sort of grounded to realistic assessments of those scenarios, really stress test, and to give the best way or best design this framework to really support energy transition or maritime decarbonization in practice, not just in principle. And also this is a really good initiative, not just only for shipping to decarbonize. It's a benefit of everyone on the planet, right? So if we already have like a global regulator, that's sort of a privilege almost for this industry to be able to enforce something like this.
Well, and it addresses what's been a major criticism of the transition and the way that we've gone about it, which is that it leaves behind those countries that are not as developed. And so this is one interesting way to try to remedy that. But Joe, Junlin, it's been a really great conversation. Thanks for helping me unpack a pretty complex issue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks
for having us.
Let's recap. Decarbonizing the shipping industry is possible, but it's not just about the ships. It's about the entire energy system. The transition depends on clean fuel production, it depends on infrastructure, and it depends on global coordination, not just new engines in the vessels. Second, the IMO's net zero framework is a strong step, but the design of it matters. If it's too rigid, it risks becoming just a system of penalties instead of actually driving clean fuel adoption. It needs to reduce uncertainty and incentivize investment if it's going to work. And finally, time, capacity, and clarity are the bottlenecks here. Ship owners are caught in uncertainty. Which fuels should they choose? When should they invest? Will the supply that they need be there if they do invest? And meanwhile, shipyard capacity and fuel production capacity need to scale up dramatically to meet these targets. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Energy. This podcast is a Rystad Energy production, produced by Laura Rodriguez Skaug and Både. Check out the show notes for further analysis of the topics we've discussed today, and connect with us on social media. We're at Rystad Energy on all your major platforms. While you're there, click that like button, leave us a review, and subscribe. You can also keep up to date on our website. And if you'd like to send us a question or have some comments about what we've talked about today, please reach out directly. We're podcast@rystadenergy.com. And most importantly, don't forget to join us next week for Let's Talk Energy.